History. In the history of aerial warfare, the confrontation between American fighter aircraft and the Soviet Mig-21 is a notable chapter. The Vietnam War was the stage for many intense air battles between these two types of aircraft. The United States Air Force, with its well-trained pilots and advanced aircraft like the F-4 Phantom II, achieved numerous victories against the Mig-21. However, this was a fierce clash between two generations of leading fighter jets of the time, with each side having its own advantages. The outcomes of these aerial battles contributed to shaping military aviation strategy and technology for decades to come. The Northern Vietnam surface-to-air front in 1972 encompassed numerous significant military activities of the parties involved in the 1972 campaign in Vietnam. This was the second confrontation between the U.S. Air Force and Navy and the three-tiered air defense forces of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Although it lasted only 8 months, the scale and intensity of the campaigns and battles far exceeded the airstrikes of Operation Rolling Thunder from 1965 to 1968, with the involvement of 3 U.S. Air Force components: Tactical Air Force, Strategic Air Force, and Naval Air Force. Within just 8 months, the damage inflicted on the U.S. Air Force amounted to more than 1/4 of the total losses incurred over the 4 years from February 1965 to the end of October 1968. The economic damage to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was roughly equivalent to the combined losses of 1967 and 1968. On May 8, 1971, the U.S. Air Force launched Operation Linebacker II, which lasted until October 23. The biggest battle for the Vietnam Air Force was on May 10, 1971, when they conducted 64 sorties, engaged in 15 battles, and shot down 7 U.S. F-4 aircraft. The Vietnam Air Force also lost 2 MiG-21s, 2 MiG-17s, and 1 J-6. In an air battle on May 10, 1971, a MiG-17 squadron took off to relieve a military airfield under U.S. air attack. The Vietnamese MiG-17s flew secretly at low altitude, hiding along the terrain, then suddenly approached the enemy. In their first air combat, the Vietnam Air Force shot down an F-4 aircraft. A flight of 2 MiG-17s engaged in combat with 4 F-4 aircraft, and Vietnam lost 1 plane. However, as the F-4s and Vietnamese MiG-17s were locked in a pursuit spiral, 2 Vietnamese MiG-21s took off from the blockaded airfield, quickly gaining altitude. At a distance of about 2 kilometers, the Vietnamese MiG-21s launched missiles and shot down 2 enemy F-4s. On May 11, 1971, 2 Vietnamese MiG-21s flew as bait to lure 4 F-4s into an ambush set by 2 MiG-21s flying at low altitude. The Vietnamese MiG-21s launched a surprise attack and, with 3 missiles, the Vietnam Air Force destroyed 2 F-4 aircraft. On June 13, a MiG-21 squadron intercepted a group of F-4 Phantom IIs. Diving into the middle of the formation, 2 MiG-21s broke up the F-4's combat formation, causing the Phantoms to panic and maneuver erratically. The 2 Vietnamese MiG-21s fired 2 missiles in succession, downing 2 F-4s. On May 18, the Vietnam Air Force conducted 26 sorties and engaged in 8 battles, shooting down 4 F-4 aircraft. The Vietnam Air Force suffered no losses. In another battle on the same day, 2 MiG-21 aircraft intercepted an F-4 squadron. The squadron commander, Captain Gu, while performing a half-roll, launched a missile destroying another U.S. F-4. In the summer of 1972, U.S. Air Force operations decreased. On June 12, 1972, an F-4 Phantom squadron encountered 2 MiG-21s and lost 1 aircraft. The following day, there were 2 more air battles between F-4s and MiG-21s, with the U.S. Air Force losing 2 more F-4s. The Vietnam Air Force suffered no losses. Thus, in the spring and summer of 1972, there were 360 U.S. aircraft engaged in combat over North Vietnam and 96 U.S. Navy aircraft, the majority being the final upgraded model of F-4s. Air combat with the Vietnam Air Force involved MiG-17s, MiG-21s, and JSEXS, totaling 187 aircraft, of which 71 were combat-capable, including 31 MiG-21s. In December 1972, the U.S. Air Force launched Operation Linebacker II, conducting massive attacks across North Vietnam, focusing on major cities like Hanoi and Haiphong, aiming to achieve political objectives at the Paris peace talks.
The US
Air Force deployed most of its B-52 strategic bombers in the Asia-Pacific region for this operation. In this strategic air raid using B-52 bombers, the U.S. concentrated a large military force. The White House believed that Hanoi would not be able to withstand the power of a Hiroshima without an atomic bomb. However, the actual result was costly for the U.S. 81 American aircraft were shot down, including 34 B-52 strategic bombers and 5 F-111 aircraft, with many American pilots captured. Suffering significant losses of B-52 strategic bombers, U.S. President Nixon was forced to announce a halt to the raids, return to the conference table, and agree to sign the Paris Peace Accords, restoring peace in Vietnam. During the 12 days and nights of Operation Linebacker II, with 8 air battles, the U.S. Air Force extensively used active jamming techniques. This technique caused many difficulties for Vietnam's radar guidance stations, and the Mig-21 pilots' radar screens were completely covered with interference signals. Vietnamese pilots had to shoot using regular sights and use infrared-guided missiles, but when using infrared-guided missiles, the firing range was reduced and the launch distance was also inaccurate. This was also the biggest weakness of the Mig-21 due to radar tracking and target following being jammed. Nevertheless, in 8 air battles, the U.S. Air Force lost 7 aircraft, including 4 F-4s. The Vietnam Air Force also lost 3 MiG-21s. And despite having pilots well trained in anti-MiG-21 tactics and using dense jamming techniques and night flying, the U.S. Air Force still suffered heavy losses. To serve strategic goals and exploiting American pilots' fear of MiG-21s and SAM missiles, Vietnamese MiG aircraft employed tactics avoiding one-on-one dogfights. Vietnamese MiGs were ordered to intercept from a distance, suddenly attack to break the enemy formation, then quickly disengage and return to the airbase, forcing F-4 fighter bombers to lower their altitude into the dense ground-based anti-aircraft fire. Despite these tactics, MiG-21 still held advantages in speed and maneuverability at medium and low altitudes against American F-4E and F-4J aircraft. On December 22, 1972, the Vietnam Air Force intercepted a U.S. air attack. A flight of 2 MiG-21s took off. During the dogfight, 1 MiG was shot down. On December 23, a flight of 4 MiG-21s took off and shot down 1 F-4. On December 27, another MiG-21 flight took off and shot down 2 F-4s. On the same day, 2 MiG-21s on standby at Noi Bai Airport took off, flying at a low altitude of 300 m above ground, secretly approaching their targets before accelerating and gaining altitude. The target was visually identified at a distance of 8 kilometers. Given the order to attack, the MiG-21 suddenly approached the target and launched a missile, downing an F-4. The flight leader, while returning, spotted 2 more F-4s pursuing the Vietnamese wingman. In a flash, with a skillful maneuver, the leader broke the enemy formation, cutting off the wingman from the enemy F-4 group. Dogfights ensued between pairs of MiG-21s and F-4 Phantom IIs. As a result, the leader escaped the F-4's pursuit and landed safely, while the wingman, when suddenly climbing to a higher altitude, shot down another F-4. However, his aircraft was also severely damaged by a Sidewinder missile exploding near the jet exhaust. The Vietnamese pilot safely ejected. During the B-52 bombing raids, fearing MiG-21 attacks, F-4s played the role of decoys and ambushers. F-4 squadrons flew at cruising speed in tight formations. On radar screens, these targets appeared similar to B-52s. When MiGs attacked, F-4s would disperse and maneuver to counterattack the MiG-21s. However, 2 B-52s were shot down by MiG-21s. One was downed by hero pilot Pham Tuan at a range of 2,000 m. Another was shot down by hero pilot Vu Quang Thieu at close range, with the aircraft flying into the explosion point.
Héros pilote Vu Quang Thieu sacrifiçait his life.
Throughout 1972, there were 201 air battles between the U.S. Air Force and the Vietnam Air Force. The Vietnamese side lost 54 aircraft, including 36 MiG-21s and 1 MiG-21 U.S. trainer. The U.S. side lost 90 aircraft, including 74 F-4s and 2 RF-4C reconnaissance aircraft. MiG-21s alone destroyed 67 U.S. aircraft. The last strange victory for the Americans in the air war in Vietnam was when an F-4J Phantom II, taking off from the carrier Midway under the command of Lieutenant Victor Kowaleski, shot down a MiG-17 with a Sidewinder missile. However, 2 days later, this same F-4J piloted by Lieutenant Kowaleski was shot down over Vietnam's skies. It managed to limp out to sea before crashing, with both pilots rescued. Thus, the 2-to-1 ratio was maintained throughout the air war between the U.S. Air Force and the Vietnam Air Force. From a tactical perspective, it can be observed that, despite continuously changing tactics, combat methods, and weapon systems, and having pilots with much more experience and flight hours, the U.S. Air Force was unable to destroy the Vietnamese Air Force. Instead, they suffered heavy losses. Given the confined space of the North Vietnamese battlefield and the loss of nearly 4,000 U.S. Air Force aircraft, it can be said that the Americans were defeated in the skies over North Vietnam. American pilots had to fight on two fronts, against the skilled MiG pilots of Vietnam and against the technical deficiencies of the heavy F-4. If pilots were trained for dynamic and maneuverable combat methods, but had to control a fighter bomber with poor maneuverability, it posed a problem. The F-4 could only evade an attack but couldn't counterattack effectively because the MiG-21 was lighter, with better turning angles and acceleration capabilities to gain advantageous attack positions. When escorting B-52 strategic bombers to their targets, the F-4's mission constraints prevented it from engaging in free maneuverable combat with enemy aircraft, limiting it to reactive and passive defense. When the top gunfighter group appeared, the battlefield situation changed, but the power of S-75 missiles and the dense ground-based anti-aircraft fire network locked down the combat capabilities of these highly skilled pilots. Therefore, the coordination between reconnaissance and guidance radar stations, anti-aircraft missiles, and anti-aircraft artillery with the Air Force significantly increased the combat capabilities of the Vietnam Air Force multiple times. Vietnamese pilots succeeded in imposing their fighting style on American pilots. Their ambush and attack plans forced the U.S. Air Force into a passive defensive position, and when the Americans switched to offense, they were also passive and less flexible. Although the loss ratio of American aircraft compared to MiGs was quite high at 2-to-1, it's clear that the casualty rate would have been lower if Vietnamese pilots had more flight hours, greater combat experience, and fully utilized the tactical capabilities of the MiG-21. The lessons from the air war over Vietnam left many special impressions. The Vietnamese Air Force succeeded in confronting the powerful and experienced U.S. Air Force. There are many issues still to be debated, but if the Vietnamese Air Force had been fully equipped with weapons and war materials, combat experience, and training time, the American losses in this air war would not have stopped at a 2-to-1 ratio, and there would have been more than just 2 B-52s destroyed by MiG-21s over Hanoi's skies. The air war in Vietnam confirmed that speed, maneuverability with intelligent tactics, mastery of the technical and tactical capabilities of the aircraft, along with dynamic, creative, and tight command from the strategic and operational levels to the absolute obedience of the pilot to their direct commander, determined success or failure on the battlefield. The strength of air forces in aerial combat largely depends on the close coordination between firepower, reconnaissance, early warning systems, and the ability to fully exploit the technical and tactical capabilities of aircraft. Equally important are the dynamism, creativity, and combat readiness training level of pilots in flight. In modern warfare, multi-role fighter aircraft like the F-16, F-18, MiG-29, and Su-30MK have many strengths, including high-power radar systems, long-range air-to-air missiles, powerful machine guns, and high maneuverability. However, air combat seems to be not just a technical confrontation. It is also a contest of combat capabilities, offensive and defensive maneuvering skills, especially the ability to detect targets in all weather conditions, avoid air-to-air missiles, and perform complex flight techniques, close combat, and escape maneuvers. Although the war ended 45 years ago, analyzing the lessons from these air battles, the skills demonstrated by pilots on both sides in this uneven confrontation, the tactics employed by both sides, and the victories and losses remain important lessons in modern warfare. Thus, we have reviewed the story of how the United States Air Force confronted and achieved victory against the Mig-21 in the Vietnam War. This confrontation is not only an important chapter in military aviation history, but also a valuable lesson on the importance of technology, tactics, and training. If you found this video useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next interesting content about military history. You can also leave a comment below if you have any questions or opinions. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.